Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. In this one we will have a look at a project I've been working on for the last few months. An update to the Apple TV Bootloader project. We will test my current version by trying to boot different Linux operating systems from different kinds of media. For example, from a DVD drive. So let's get started. So while the Apple TV is booting, let me introduce you to today's setup. Here we have the Apple TV first generation, as usual. I removed the hard drive and Wi-Fi card because we don't need them right now. To the Apple TV's singular USB port, I connected this huge USB hub here. It's a powered USB hub because I needed to connect a few power-hungry devices to it. First of all, I connected a USB keyboard. Then a USB boot stick, which the Apple TV is currently booting from. It contains my new Apple TV Bootloader. The two remaining USB sticks here are Linux Live USB sticks, which we will try to boot from. And last but not least, I also connected a USB DVD drive, as you can see here, because we can also boot from DVDs. So now let me explain how the bootloader actually works. On this USB stick is basically a teeny tiny Linux installation. It's based on a Linux distribution called Alpine Linux, which is known for being very lightweight and small. This has been augmented with a few kernel modules to make sense of all of the periphery that we're going to connect to the Apple TV, and a few scripts that enable us to boot different Linux kernels. So basically what we can see here is already part of the UI of this bootloader. It detected our two USB sticks, which we can see here as SDB and SDA. And it also detected that there are Linux kernels present on these drives. So if we want to, for example, boot the Pen2 Linux, which is basically a customized version of Gentoo, we have to select this kernel right here. In the next step, we have to select the initrd. So basically the Linux kernel's temporary root file system. Here it's conveniently also called Pen2, so it's easy to find. Let's select that. And in the last step, we have to select the kernel command line. So here we can specify different boot arguments. And what we can do is just reuse the one that we already booted the Apple TV from. This can be used if we were, for example, booting another version of Alpine Linux. We could just reuse the kernel command line. We could also just leave everything blank, but set the root partition, so tell the kernel which drive it's actually booting from and where the root file system will be located. I've also added support for the old Debian Casper boot live CDs, which we will try later. We can type in anything we want manually, or we can just leave it blank and skip the kernel command line. Let's just leave it blank because I know that this USB stick actually doesn't boot from the Apple TV. So if I hit enter here, what it actually does in the background is it basically uses the information we gave to the bootloader, and it then uses kexec to start this Linux kernel for us. This method has been used for years now to boot Linux distributions on the Apple TV. For example, I used it in the M.2 SSD on Apple TV video and on the eGPU video and the Android video, many different videos I used this method. And I wasn't the first one to use that. There were people in 2008 that used this method. The only thing I did is bring it back into modern times because the old bootloader, for example, couldn't detect file systems that didn't exist at that time. So for example, it couldn't read a ext4 file system. And the last improvement is, of course, usability. You don't have to type everything in manually. You can just go through this menu and hit enter, and that's it. So my idea was to streamline the process of getting a Linux up and running on your Apple TV. I know there's also a process where you embed the initrd and Linux kernel into the Mac kernel itself to boot the Apple TV that way, which is of course what I used to boot the Alpine Linux in the first place. But the idea here is to have a bootloader where I can just quickly boot, I don't know, a Ubuntu or a Debian or an AntiX or whatever I want to boot from here. And I don't have to first create the initrd and build the kernel and do stuff like that. That's basically the goal of this project. And to stop the rambling here, let's just see what distributions we can actually boot from here. And if we can actually boot from the CD drive, because I think that would be so funny to boot a operating system that was never designed for this device from a storage medium that was never designed for this device. So let's get started. So here I quickly gathered my collection of Linux distros that are 32-bit compatible. So what distribution do we want to start with? Maybe let's try a distro that we actually already used. On this disk is the 2023 version of AntiX Linux. And since I know that this boots from the internal drive and actually from an NVMe SSD, I hope it will also boot from the DVD drive. So let's see. We first have to, of course, boot the Apple TV, and I will skip this process for now because, I mean, the Apple TV boots really slow. So see you once we are in the boot menu. Okay, so as you can see, we are in the boot menu, and as you can also see, we have a new mount point where we can select a Linux kernel from called SR0, which is our CD or DVD drive. It found a kernel which you can boot here, and there should also be a initrd which we can see here. I don't know what kind of kernel parameters we want, so for now I will just set it to automatically detect root and write that to the kernel command line. Okay, the DVD spins up, which is a good sign, I guess. Okay, we've lost USB, which is typical because when the new kernel is booted, yeah, as you can see, USB comes back. So we lose USB because the old kernel dies, and then once the new kernel takes over, we get USB functionality back. The question is now, do we get our DVD drive back? Okay, it took some time, but the DVD drive is now spinning up again. I don't really see anything on the screen yet. It's just blue. Dabbidi-dabbidi. No. Oh. Haha, okay, we're actually booting. As usual, these Linux distributions have a hard time with the frame buffer of the Apple TV, which is probably the reason why the picture is now a bit purplish. But most of them actually, once the driver for the graphics card is actually loaded, they work just fine. Hey, it actually booted! I don't really know why it's this slow. Normally, if you boot from a CD, the file system gets loaded into the system memory, and then the access is kind of fast. Maybe because the Apple TV only has 256 megabytes of system memory, it can't load the whole operating system into there, so it has to load everything from the disk, which is super slow. I don't actually know. Hey, the file manager actually opened. And it only took us, I don't know, 2 minutes. But it is still a success. We could use this method to install the Linux operating system now onto the internal hard drive. And yeah, that's all I wanted to see. If we could actually get a Linux running from a DVD drive connected to the Apple TV, and we could, which is super funny. I mean, look at it. We have a DVD drive connected to an Apple TV. which now makes this basically a Mac Mini. Because when the Apple TV was new, people said this is just a Mac Mini without the disk drive. So we've added the disk drive back. Ha! Take that, Apple. Okay, enough of these shenanigans. Let's shut this down and we can have a look at the next distro. So next up, let's try something different. On this hard drive, I have a version of Peer OS, which is a Ubuntu that is customized to look like macOS. Let's see if we can boot this. Okay, let's select the kernel, which is probably this one, in /boot. And the init.rd is probably this one. Since this is a full Linux installation, I think we can just set the root parameter and see if it boots. Okay, that looks promising. And it's pink. From what I've heard, this is because the GPU on the Apple TV is not supported in old versions of Linux, which means the frame buffer is not supported, and yeah, that's basically why the colors are weird in some versions of Linux. I think we had the same problem in the Android on Apple TV video, but I mean, it seems to be working. And it's quite a bit faster than loading from the CD drive. So here you can see what Peer OS is. It's basically Ubuntu skinned to look like macOS Leopard, I'd say. You have the transparent dock here, you have Launchpad, which interestingly came with Lion, I think. So it doesn't really fit here. The App Store as well. And I don't know why it... Okay, it's just slow. But as you can see, it's working, it's running from the hard drive here. And yeah, I think that's pretty cool. I don't know if you have seen the videos about Redstar OS, which is basically North Korea's distribution of choice. It's basically the same idea. They have a Debian, as far as I know, with KDE that is skinned to look like macOS. So if this idea is good enough for North Korea, it's good enough for me. Let's see our computer details. So yeah, here you can see we have a genuine Intel processor, not a fake one. And it's clocked at 1 GHz. We have a unknown graphics card. As we can see by the colors, it just doesn't recognize our graphics card. And we have a 320 GB hard disk. And our system has 256 MB of RAM in total. So yeah, as you can see, it runs pretty well on here besides the weird colors. So let's have a look at another distro. Let's have a look at some older Ubuntu versions. I've got anything here from 2008 onwards, and I've also got a few versions of Debian, so let's see if one of them boots. Let's start with my favorite version of Ubuntu, which is 8.10. It's my favorite version of Ubuntu because it's literally the first version of Linux I've ever used. Okay, so let's see, where is our kernel? It's here, and our init.rd is here.
Thousands of tears later.
So I've now tried every release between Ubuntu 8.4 and Ubuntu 11.4. Some of them on DVDs, some of them on USB sticks, some I tried both. None of them actually worked. It's always the same picture. The Apple TV turns off in order to load the new kernel, which is normal. All the USB devices get disconnected, which is also normal, but they don't come back, which isn't normal. So I think it's safe to say that old Ubuntu just doesn't work. Maybe I can fix this in the future, but for now, let's just accept this and test some other versions of Linux. So here I have a few other modern, super small Linux distributions that we can try on the Apple TV. Okay, so let's first start with Porteous. Porteous is a super small desktop Linux distribution based on Slacks Linux. The idea is to install it onto a USB drive and have a portable Linux distro that you can take anywhere. First, let's try it from DVD, and if it doesn't work, we can try it from USB. But I think it's a super cool distro, and I really want to see if it works on the Apple TV because it has really low system requirements. So let's see if it boots. Okay, the disk spins back up. Okay. Sadly, it appears to be pink again, but it does look promising. Let's see if it boots. Okay, so the disk actually just spun down. I do have a cursor, but that's about it. Let's try some other parameters in the kernel command line. Okay, so I've booted the disk on another system and looked at the kernel command line there. So let's see what changes if I type the same thing in here.
15 minutes later.
And the result is the same. So let's try another operating system.
Thousands of tears later.
Welcome back to Miseryland. So I spent almost a whole day now finding other super small Linux distros that might work on the Apple TV, burning them to disk or imaging them to a USB stick. And none of them worked. I tried Ubuntu's, a few more Debian versions, LXLE, Peppermint, Bonson Linux, Slacks, and not a single one was booting correctly. I have no idea why, but I need to fix this. If you know of any other small Linux distros I could try on the Apple TV, just write me a comment and I might do a follow-up. Okay, so the last thing I want to try is in these two CD cases. And it is actually Chrome OS. So I really don't know where I got these from. So I burned these when I was a teenager and they appear to be a super early version of Chrome OS or Chromium OS based on Gen 2. So let's see if we can boot them, because that is actually the weirdest Linux distro that I have in my collection. And I can't even find any information about that online. Maybe if some of you have any idea where these versions came from, or yeah, if they're like development builds or some leaked image or whatever, please feel free to inform me in the comments, because I really have no idea anymore where they came from. Okay, let's see if we can boot that. It's doing something. Ooh, okay, there's at least the old Chrome logo from back in the day in the 2010s. Okay, so it's now half an hour later, and as you can see, I'm not really sure what happened here. We got this low disk warning at about 10 minutes, and I can't really move the cursor anymore. The drive is still spinning. And we're now at the screen where we can choose our search engine, and it automatically opened Chrome. So I have no idea what to do now. Actually, I think we just... Oh, I can move the cursor. I couldn't before. Can I move this window? No, I can't interact with any of these windows. I've actually never seen this glitch before. Most of the older Linux kernels that don't support the frame buffer of the GPU here, they get the colors wrong. But I've never seen a problem where we have the same window like 4 times. And I mean, even here the colors appear to be a bit off. Yeah, I mean, we got it booting. It's not really the fault of this development build of Chrome OS or whatever it is, that it doesn't support the Apple TV. But I guess that's it. So that was fun. We tried so many different operating systems on the Apple TV, and some even worked. No, in all honesty, the bootloader works well and it does what I wanted to do, but it's still a long way to go. The fact that no version of Ubuntu or Debian was working and many of these super small Linux distros didn't work as well means I still have some stuff to fix. If you want to contribute to the project, the GitHub link is down in the description. Anyways, I hope you had fun watching. If you want to see more shenanigans like this, for example an even weirder operating system on the Apple TV, booted from a CD, consider subscribing, and I'll see you next time.